Today, we're going to be covering a conversation on diversity in banking with Citi's Susan Kendall. And today, moderating today's conversation will be Alison Beard. And I didn't want to miss the chance to also thank our sponsors for making all of this possible, making the speakers possible, our attendees, our audience, everything. So thank you so much. Today on the line, we have Susan V. Kendall. Susan was named Chief Financial Officer of Citi's Global Consumer Banking business in June 2019. Previously, she was head of investor relations from 2012 to 2019, where she was responsible for managing Citi's relationships with institutional investors and research analysts in both the equity and fixed income markets. Susan was a senior sponsor of Citi's Financial Management Associate and Analyst programs from 2016 to 2019, and she remains integrally involved in the recruiting and development of future finance leaders. She is also the executive sponsor for Citi's Women in Finance program. Prior to joining Citi in 2009, Susan served as Senior Vice President, Investor Relations for Lehman Brothers, Inc. From 2005 to 2008, she was a senior banker in equity capital markets, responsible for structuring and marketing equity securities for corporate clients in the retail and consumer sectors. She joined Lehman Brothers in 1998 in investment banking, where she advised clients on M&A and capital raising activities. Susan received her MBA from the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business and a BA from Duke University. She is a member of the YWCA Academy of Women's Leaders and the David Rockefeller Fellows Program. And moderating today's conversation, we have Alison Beard. Alison Beard is a senior editor at Harvard Business Review, overseeing the experience section of the magazine and much of its leadership and self-management content. She is the co-host of two of HBR's podcasts, the HBR Idea Cast, a Q&A with a management expert, and Dear HBR, which offers advice on listeners' workplace dilemmas. Beard was previously a reporter and editor for the Financial Times in both New York and London. She was recently named to Folio's 2019 class of top women in media and earned a BA in journalism and politics from Washington and Lee University. So with that, I am so excited to hand over the mic and obviously very honored to have introduced both of you today. So thank you so much for being here.
So excited. Thank you. Susan, are you on with me?
I am, if I can take myself off of mute. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited for today as well.
Great. So I'd love to start by talking about your own career. You know, you're the CFO of a large division of a big bank that's not a function or a field known for supporting women particularly well. So how did you do it?
Goodness, I think I did it by not thinking of it that way, right? I think you need to enter the room sort of feeling like you've got a spot there. I always wholeheartedly believed, I maybe put positive intent out there that I would be rewarded based on my capabilities and skills. And I have found consistently that if you show up and you perform and you sort of take the opportunities and advantages in front of you, that it really can be an industry and a field, with finance and banking, but it can be a meritocracy where you can really stand on your own. I think to do that, you need to find mentors in many cases that don't look like you, because the fact is you may be going where others have not gone before. I've very often been the most senior woman in any organization, as I've risen up the ranks. But I also think that's a good thing, right? Surrounding yourself with a diversity of perspectives that are like you and not like you, has been one of the keys. And, I have found that, I have found as many people who I really kind of sync up with, who I feel like have gotten to know me and have helped me through some of my larger career transitions, that are male, female, inside the business, outside the business, and like any set of human beings, the more kind of diverse you can put together a population of your own advisory board, if you think about it that way, I think that helps a lot. I mean, ultimately, you need to bring your whole self to work and feel like you can really be who you are without having to put some sort of mask on.
So when you're an entry-level employee or even an up-and-coming manager, how do you build those kinds of relationships that you're talking about?
Look, I think a lot's made out of how to think about networking and how to develop that. And I think organizations, Citi and other places where I've been, have done, I think they're aware that that's not always an easy thing. And so there's lots of formal structures put in place. The Women in Finance, structure here, the mentors that we put in place when our new, finance associates, or management associates come in the door. And sometimes those are matches, made in heaven, and sometimes they're not. I think it's great that the organizations, set up some of those more formal structures. I have found as often that I've made a connection either with someone who I've continued to mentor or for someone that has mentored me when you've had an organic project that you're working on, or they have the opportunity to actually sort of see you in action. And I think too often, if we have those interactions with people who might not be in our immediate sphere, you sort of move on from it and you let those, relationships languish sometimes. I have always been open to, and I have found people have been open to me when you do that and say, like, great, it was really great to work on this project. And that can be inside of work, outside of work. Would you mind if we touch base on a regular basis? Like, I really appreciate your perspective, on this. I'd love to keep up that relationship. I'm always happy to take those calls, and I have found others have always been happy to take them for me. And I think the basis of a shared experience, tends to build a strong foundation for those types of relationships.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to take this moment just to remind everyone in our audience that I'm going to be going through my questions first, but we definitely want yours as well. So please pop them into the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. But let me stick with my questions for a little bit longer.
So I know a little bit about what's coming, and then you can throw me for a loop.
Yeah. So, it seems like you didn't face that many challenges in your career, but there must have been some.
Oh.
And so talk to me a little bit about sort of the biggest ones that you face and how you overcame them and what you might see, with other women in finance, for example.
Right. Look, I think it always helps to remind you take a look at anyone's resume or, the bio that they read when I come up on something like this, and it feels like, I must have had this all planned out, or that, it was a smooth transition. I will tell you one of the experiences of going through the financial crisis and now COVID is that you really never know what to expect, and you need to be flexible in terms of how you think about your path. I had been an investment banker out of business school. I kind of hard driving banker chick, self-proclaimed, for pretty much my first 10 years out, and found myself in early 2008, in the early stages of the crisis, covering retail and consumer companies that were sort of, out of favor as we were going into, gosh, we didn't quite know how deep, but we knew something was coming from an economic perspective. And found myself at a point where there was no natural deal flow. I had just been passed over for promotion because they wanted to see another a year of progress. To which I asked, a year of what? Like from what I could see, there's not going to be a lot of activity in this space. So as I like to joke, my manager and I, came to sort of a, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here sort of, conversation, because there wasn't going to be enough activity in the area that I was in. So I was really sort of, 10 years in, felt like I had done a lot of good things. I'd progressed. And all of a sudden, I was just at this sort of stagnant point. And at the same time, I think if I was honest with myself, the things I enjoyed early on in my career, being a junior person, even working the late hours, but feeling like you were learning a lot, you were in it together, you were part of a team, became a little bit less part of my job the more senior I got. It became a more individual endeavor. It became a little bit more, how much revenues can you bring in? It was almost a quasi-sales type of position. And I had to be honest to myself, I was probably taking a lot less enjoyment out of the role, but I could only think of myself in that seat because that's all I had done for the past decade. So the combination of me being at sort of that point in my career, the impending financial crisis, really led me to have to take a step back and think about what I wanted to do next. And I would say even then, I limited myself. Looking back, I can't believe how much I limited myself, but I was looking at other banking jobs. I was looking at other sectors, but the circle I sort of defined for myself was rather narrow. At the time, a woman had just been named as CFO of Lehman Brothers, Erin Callan. She'd been a banker before. We'd worked together, and she was my mentor, I think formally, but one of those relationships that had really kind of taken seed because we'd done some deals together and had a good amount of interaction with each other. And she called and said, would you consider taking a position on the finance team? So step away from the client-facing business and work for Lehman. And I kind of argued back with her. I said, well, like, I haven't focused on financials. I'm really not quite sure about this new role, investor relations. Haven't really thought about that before. You know my background. I appreciate it, but I'm not quite sure why I'm right for it. And she really, she positioned a way that made sense. She said, all you've really done for your career so far is advise CEOs and CFOs on strategy and valuation, how to present their businesses to the markets. We want you to do that for Lehman. So I said, okay, like she actually reframed it in a way that made sense to me. And I found over and over again, like trusting someone else who knows you and knows what your potential is, even when you can't see it yourself, is something that has sort of defined some of those critical points in my career. Now, 6 months later, we were bankrupt.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
It ended up being a strange time to take that left turn, if you will. But I would say the thing I learned about myself, and I wouldn't have given myself the opportunity left to my own devices, is I really loved being part of the management team. And so even after Lehman went under, I didn't say, okay, let me get back to the client-facing piece of it. I had found a home again where I was part of a team where you could take what I thought was a longer-term view before the bankruptcy. And I loved being part of the management team, and it really defined everything I did thereafter. I'll close it with 6 months after I decided to take on the role. We were bankrupt. I was 8 months pregnant. I had lost most of my life savings when Lehman went down. There were no jobs out in the market. And so I was basically home unemployed with a newborn, unsure of where my career was going to go and if anyone was even really going to be interested in hiring me again. So you think about the ups and downs of any individual career that doesn't show up on a bio or a resume. That was probably my most challenging point.
Yeah. So I was going to interject and ask if part of your hesitation was it being a functional role, but it sounds like you overcame that hesitation pretty quickly and learned that you really liked sort of supporting the organization as opposed to sort of being the shiny bright thing that went out into the world. But so let's talk about the Lehman bankruptcy, being a new mom. How did you bounce back from that blow? I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, it was one, I think it showed how much of my self-identity was tied up in my career and quite frankly, even the investment banker title for a while there. And it does put everything into perspective. So, when I waddled out with my box of belongings, that last day, I really didn't know where things were going to go. I didn't know how I was going to feel about being a new mom. And really my health identity really changed quite dramatically over the course of those 6 months. But looking back, I never would have given myself, it was almost a year before I found another position and went back to the office. I don't think I would have given myself that time of sort of self-reflection. And I always tell my oldest son now, I remind him, you don't remember it, but we had all this really sweet time together. It also reinforced the fact that I like working. So, about 6 months in, I did say, okay, I've sort of got my feet under me now as a new mom. I'm pretty sure that while I'm enjoying this, there's a big part of me that I miss, which is out in the world and contributing in that career factor. And so, I started to reach out to people that I knew from my investment banking roles, from others, but I was really clear I was interested in something on the functional side. A few people pointed me in the direction of Citi, and I was nervous about coming back because the last time I worked, I had no one else that I needed to answer to. I mean, my husband, but I didn't have sort of dependence in the same way. And so I think I came back in with a better appreciation for who I needed to be at work. And I think I would have found it very difficult to have to go back and pretend I wasn't a mother or pretend I hadn't been through kind of the trauma that I had in terms of the last business role. And so from the very start, I had pictures of my kids all over the place. If I had to be out for a doctor's appointment or the other. I said, you know what, this is who I am now, and you've got to kind of, take or leave all of me, if you will. And I found one, Citi was great about that. Even the fact that 3 months into my new job, I found out I was pregnant again. So very accommodating of all of that. But it really, it set in my mind what was important. It broadened the definition of myself by necessity, becoming a mom and having these other experiences. And hopefully it makes me a better manager now. I always joke there's no one more efficient than a working mom. And hopefully I can impart that on my team too, that you really, you shouldn't be ashamed of the fact that you've got other things going on in your life. And if we can't figure out how to make work and life work for you, then this isn't going to be a sustainable solution. And that's not in anyone's best interest.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The one thing I say to all sort of soon to be new working moms is that just be completely upfront about it. Say, my family is a huge priority in my life, and so is this job, and we're gonna balance the two. But and there's a benefit to making a transition during that time, because people don't remember the way you used to be, where you stayed till work till 10 p.m. But at the same time, if you're still in your organization, you do have that goodwill. So one of our audience members has a follow-up question. Given this experience that you had with the bankruptcy, what advice would you give to other women who feel that they're in a similar position now because of the COVID-19 crisis? They've been forced out of work.
Yeah. Look, I think I look back now and everyone's like, oh, you got all that time off. It was stressful, right? Because you didn't know in what capacity you would come back, what people's interest would be. I did try and spend the time trying to be clear, especially being a new mom, to like what was going to get me motivated to actually go back to work and leave this, human being that, I created and had created this bond with. And so one, I spent the time trying to figure out what is it that makes me tick. And having gotten, I'd gotten in some ways tracked in investment banking, which is really easy to do when you come out of business school. This gave me the opportunity to figure out, like, what do I actually like doing? What kind of problems do I like solving? What kind of team environment do I like being in? Which gave me the time to reflect on what would make me happy to go back. And so at the time, I think you're inclined to just, take whatever opportunity you can. And I explored a lot of things that didn't end up being right for me, but I really tried to make sure I could look back and say I'd used the time productively, and just being open to what others see in your potential. I think at any time that I've stayed in a role longer than I should have, or I maybe took something that felt like a risk, like the IR role that turned out to be really good for me, I can look back and I had people around me who saw the potential in me, even that I wasn't willing to the credit I wasn't willing to give to myself. I trusted people who knew me well. And it's usually it's a good thing. So lean on the people around you on to try to expand your aperture a little bit around what might make you tick.
Yeah. And I think such an important part of having a job as a working woman is to have a supportive boss and supportive team. You mentioned the ways in which you try to do that as a manager. Are there any particular, pieces of advice you would give to the people in our audience who do lead others about, how to support women and people of color? What more would you like to see from individual managers in this world to support diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think one is sort of walking the walk, right? If I want them to be open about the fact that they've got other commitments and that they're, that it's a constant sort of juggle, I'm going to let you know about mine too. I try and actually I'd like to get to know the people on my team, the constraints, the other issues they might be dealing with, just so they feel comfortable, raising those. And I'll do the same. My team members might know too much about my kids and their various activities, but I feel like it's good to make sure that you're modeling that kind of behavior, that it's okay to acknowledge that this isn't the only thing that you are. I think the other, I talked to someone last week about joining my team, and we had a very upfront conversation about her husband also has another job. There's periods of time during the day when she really wants to be available for her kids for homework. And she's asking me these questions that, is this going to be an issue? I said, if that was an issue, I shouldn't have my job, right? I said, first of all, I was happy that she felt open to have the conversation with me. I not disappointed, but a little surprised that she thought that might be an impediment to her taking the role, because I trust that she's, she's going to get things done in whatever way works best for her family. But I think making sure people know they can have those open conversations and modeling that behavior yourself is an important first step.
So often, though, the people in more junior roles, don't look like and can't identify with the situations of the people above them. So for example, if I'm a young Black woman trying to talk about my lifestyle with an older white male boss, that conversation might be more difficult. So do you have any advice on that front about how to approach the conversation when you're not sure your boss will understand?
It's interesting, and I think it probably depends on the organization as well. And look, we benefit at Citi because we've got the infrastructure and I think the bandwidth to spend time on some of these issues. And so it's part of the dialogue, or there are ways of saying, oh, I saw so-and-so in this panel discussion. Did you see that? That was really interesting. And sort of take a Citi-sponsored venue or event to start off the conversation, because then it's already legitimately, a business topic, because, it's something that we're talking about as a business. But I well recognize that not every organization, again, has the infrastructure or the bandwidth to be hosting those events or kind of sponsoring those dialogues. And so I think being as candid as possible about even why some of what again, I always joke there's no one more efficient than a working mom, right? Like I think bringing forth the benefits of having someone with a different background, or how you position being different is a good thing, or being able to show that you're able to maybe bring more of in fact, one thing I don't have on my resume right now is I'm the one of the senior sponsors for a generations affinity group that we've started here at Citi, which talks about how do you make sure that you're listening to people of our younger generations, like in this situation, and what do they bring in terms of, I'm in a consumer business. I don't know the consumer preferences of someone from that generation as well as they do. And so if somehow you can either use a company-sponsored event or venue as the starting point for those conversations, or use some tangible examples of why having a different perspective in the room is actually, very relevant to the conversations, I think helps. But look, it's always going to be a challenge, and none of these are easy conversations or solutions.
So let's move up to the organizational level. What are some policies that you've seen implemented at Citi? Maybe you've in fact implemented them yourself, that have been particularly effective in not just diversifying the workforce, but also making everyone feel like they belong?
Yeah. So we have another hat. I'm the senior sponsor of a diversity, council inside the finance organization, which is mostly saying, like, we've got all these resources, again, at a place like Citi. Are we leveraging all of it? How do you funnel that, in particular for the hiring and the retention needs, of the finance function? And the focus there has really been a fewfold. It's recruitment, which I think is a very, sort of obvious venue. And I keep joking that, I'm really proud of the diverse mix of the classes I brought through when I was sponsoring the undergraduate and graduate recruiting program, and so 20 years from now, we're going to look great, right? Like, while that's a piece of it, you need to make sure, one, that you're retaining the talent and developing the talent that you have in-house. There's nothing more important that once you've spent all that time, finding that ideal person, that you make sure that you continue to engage, and giving them, inspiring them actually to think about their career path, just like I struggle to do, inspire them to think about their career path as being pretty broad, and giving them the kind of the training and the development and the connectivity to get there. And also, we were spending a lot of time on how do you leverage connections through these affinity groups that we have at Citi that focus on different types of diversity, through our own personal networks, sort of keeping a sort of an active pipeline and conversation going with talent of all types, even outside Citi. So when that ideal role comes up, you're not starting from, okay, now let me go try and go find, a quote unquote diverse candidate. We should be having these dialogues and be very much aware of the talent in the market as we go. There's more tactical things around. We should have diverse slates. We should have diverse interviewers. So you're getting different perspectives around the table when the decisions are being made. We've got programs like Women in Finance, where we pair, more junior with more senior women, and it's really focused on career mobility and making sure, again, that you're thinking about, your skill set in the most kind of dynamic and broad way. We have sabbatical programs, that we've put in place now, acknowledging that, this is a pretty intense work environment, and this is a marathon and not a sprint. And every once in a while, you do need that opportunity to step back and figure out what's right for you. So those are a few of the things, but more personally, it's just about keeping the dialogue fresh and recognizing that the goal is not to hit a particular, threshold level, although we have, we've got goals in mind as an organization around, diverse representation, but that's a means to getting to a population that can drive better decision making, is more nimble, more resilient, and more prepared for, what's coming in the future for our organization. So, it's nice to have a diverse slate, but we got to keep in mind why we're doing it. It's actually to run a better business.
Yeah. It does sound like Citi has a very inclusive culture, but I imagine that sort of people looking at industries to go into, wouldn't pick banking or investments as their top choice. If you are a woman, if you are a person of color, it's very much seen as an old boys club. So, how do you work to change the culture such that everyone, truly feels like they can be their authentic selves? I recently interviewed a man named Chad Sanders, who's he's the author of a book called Black Magic. He worked at Google. And he talked about the fact that he thinks that among the Black professionals he's interviewed, they're actually much more comfortable when they strike out on their own, because this sort of corporate culture that exists in the United States just inherently has been based on white men. And it's very, very slowly changing. So any advice on that front?
Look, I think we are in a unique spot. We've got a female CEO, and I work for a Black male CFO. So I do think we look different. I think if you look at the composition of our board, we were well ahead of the curve in terms of getting diverse representation at a board level. It's not perfect, though. I'm one of the few women around that CFO's table, right? So you look around and you go, okay, there are very important and visible kind of symbols and signs that things are changing, but it is, the numbers on themselves are we're still very much, the minority. But I think the more people see, people who look like them in these very visible roles. I look around the table at the global consumer business, our global head of operations, huge, we've got 100,000 people that work in the consumer business, most of which are in operations. TT Cole is a Black female executive, runs that. So, I've always gotten kind of a kick out of bucking the stereotype. I used to joke as a junior banker that, the one person they're going to remember who was at that pitch is me at whatever level. So I think starting to think about, being different and standing out as an asset, making sure that when you get to these positions, you do things like this, which are very, visible, and making sure that, your mark is out there and recognize there's a spot for people. And then I've gotten through my career assuming positive intent of the people who didn't look like me, who were in positions that I was dependent on to get promoted or to get recognition. And, I'm happy to say in most of those cases that positive intent was valid and warranted. I used to joke, if someone's going to treat me differently because I'm a woman, I'm going to make them be really overt about it. I'm going to ignore the behavior until they really make a jerk of themselves. And there's very few instances where I've had to resort to that. I find most of the time it's around awareness, and if people are open to a dialogue about what might be making you feel uncomfortable or different, most people want to do the right thing. I think having this be a regular and accepted part of the dialogue is an important step. And I think we're doing the right thing as it relates to that at Citi.
And what is Citi getting right, with regard to practices like hiring and performance reviews and promotions, even benefits that you think others, in your industry and other industries could learn from?
Yeah. I think it's been an evolution. We've gone from, an awareness of the conversation around diversity to diverse slates to, okay, you need to have not only diverse slates, but diverse interviewers who are making the decisions, to our now having, quite visible sort of diversity representation goals out there. And I'll be really honest, I've seen both sides of it. I've struggled a little bit with both sides of it because, the goal is not just to hit this representation, but get the right talent in the room too. And I don't want anyone to feel like they were ever chosen for a role I wouldn't want to feel like I was chosen for my role for any other reason than I was the right person to have it. And so, I think it's been an evolution. There's still an education. I keep getting back to the fact that it can't be about the diversity goal, but about the representation goal, but the goal of getting to better decision making, which I think has been just objectively proven happens when you've got a more diverse set of experiences and are represented in the room by any measure, by age, by race, by by gender. And so I think we are slowly kind of getting a little bit, I think, getting it into the corporate dialogue. I think we've extended our maternity leave policies. I think we've extended kind of the definition of parental leave policies, as it has as the definitions of families have changed. And I think what has helped us have been very willing to talk about these issues and social issues and equity issues publicly as a firm. And I think that it's always been a little bit, particularly in financial institutions or other areas that have probably been historically not as diverse, you're exposing yourself to candidly areas where you haven't been as strong. And I don't think that's the natural inclination of most large organizations. But our head of HR is a very forward-thinking female executive, has felt strongly about it. She had the support of Michael Corbett when he was CEO. Obviously now Jane, in her position. So having this be part of the natural organic business dialogue, I think is really important. To the fact that everyone will accept, and we're not there yet everywhere, but people need to objectively accept that a more diverse population is a better outcome.
Yeah. Because you mentioned maternal and parental leave policy, I'd love to talk a little bit more about working parenthood. There's been a lot of talk about childcare, being infrastructure recently. We know that COVID-19 was particularly hard on working women and women of color, particularly parents because of school closures. So in the absence of government policies like universal pre-K, do you think that companies should be doing anything on this front, whether it's lobbying or actually providing more benefits to their employees?
Look, I think we are inhibiting a huge talent pool by not giving women the opportunity to have safe, affordable childcare that they can feel good about, because you want to be able to, again, sort of, be able to kind of be mindful in your job and not worrying, about what's happening, to your kids back at home. To me, it's been one of the things I've been most passionate about, because that it does most often fall on the mother. It does most often impede at certain points in people's careers their ability to kind of take that next step, because they feel like they need to make the choice, between being home and being at work. I think one of the things we've tried to do is have more formal programs for sort of re-onboarding people who have taken time off, whether or not they felt like they had to or they chose to, when they've been at that point in their careers. So I think we absolutely have an obligation if we're serious about having diverse representation and better outcomes as a company. We need to do everything we can to facilitate people coming into the office or working from home better, that represent that population of working moms. So I think it's critically important, whether it's coming from the government, whether it's coming from the corporations themselves.
Yeah. One of our audience members actually is asking, do you think the finance industry as a whole is a more hospitable place for working parents now than it used to be?
Oh, yes.
COVID-19, sort of all the Zooming has made it even more so.
So it's interesting. Like when I think of it used to be, I mean, when I came to Wall Street in 1998, I do, and look, I was young, I was new, I was more often the only woman in the room. And so there was this sort of idea that you came to work and that's the only person you were. I think that has naturally evolved as I've evolved, and I obviously have, I've got 2 kids now and a husband, and I like things outside of the office, and so I need to create a little bit of that space. So part of it's probably where I am as an organization, but I firmly believe it's the organizations themselves too. I think COVID layered on top of that a willingness to think about location strategy, and I think in a way that, while not explicitly designed to help women, I think in practicality will. Women are more likely to be the second income of a dual income household. If you've got mobility opportunities, more likely to have to take in consideration, your husband's career path and mobility at the same time, as opposed to, single income families where either gender is working, but can more easily, transplant. I've already had career development conversations with women on my team who are outside of New York around New York-based roles that I don't think they would have been as readily accepted for in the past. And so I do think it's opening up again the aperture of how managers think about where their staff needs to be. I think broadly, but I do think it has the potential to help, the female population, perhaps even have a bigger impact on the female population, even that perhaps has more mobility restrictions, at least at points in time in their career.
Yeah, I think that's good news for all of us, and something positive can come out of this whole experience.
I hope so.
So we've talked a lot about what managers and what organizations can do. Are there some employee-led initiatives that you've seen help the DEI effort at Citi or elsewhere?
Yeah, look, there's only so much I feel like we can do through these corporate-led affinity groups. There's some fascinating venues. I saw, TT Cole, who I just spoke about as who our head of ops, interviewed, Misty Copeland, which I just found fascinating as a former, very amateur dancer myself, about, the challenges. And so just the opportunity to put yourself in the shoes of others and put that perspective, I think, is helpful at the top of the house. But how that's really going to change people's day-to-day, I think, really needs to be kind of more grassroots. And so we've got great part of the challenge of being one of the affinity group SteerCo members, as I am with the Generations Affinity, is kind of scooping up all the great work that's being done on the ground that we may not even realize, right? We've found we've got a population who really care about each other, who are enthusiastic about these issues, and in a lot of cases haven't waited for the corporate mandate to go create a venue. And so I've seen it in pockets. We've already had reverse mentoring programs in places like Asia for a while that ties into this, or something as simple as we've done playlists recently where you choose music from different generations and share kind of what it means to you, and sort of some of that had been happening already. And so a lot of the affinity group work is, again, sort of scooping up that grassroots effort, trying to leverage best practices and make it more visible to people. On my own team, in the wake of some of the racial and inequality events over the past year, there was a core group that just decided, let's get together and have these hard conversations on, what is it like for you to come into, the office? What in your background might color how you approach an issue, and really kind of let barriers down on topics that may not have been quote unquote work topics before, in an attempt to just to really understand each other's experience. That predated this diversity council that we have up and running on at the top of the finance organization. But it's a great example of, like, the people on my team didn't wait. They saw a need, and they organized it themselves. And now we're actually taking some of those learnings and trying to replicate it in other parts of finance. But I love that. So that self-led initiative is always going to be more powerful than what we can impose from the top.
Yeah. So, Citi can affect sort of what happens within its own organizations and supporting women and people of color, but you also are in this position of making loans and investments, so being able to affect the broader world. How are you working to diversify the people that you serve, the businesses that you serve, and ensure that they're getting equitable treatment in terms of, the size of the loan they can get and the interest rate they're given?
Yeah. Look, for not only out of the goodness of our hearts, but a lot of that is law, right? Like you can't discriminate on some of these events. We spend a lot of time making sure that we are complying with all of those standards and not doing anything even inadvertent as it relates to how we're approaching people digitally, and the like. Beyond that, we've got standards out there in terms of suppliers that we'll deal with, and giving opportunities to minority-owned firms. If you take it to the capital markets, working with, I think Wall Street has actually a very long-standing tradition of working with minority-owned brokerage houses as it relates to distributing securities. We are making investments as a firm in minority-owned companies. If you look at some of our venture work and elsewhere, we are developing relationships with some of the historically Black colleges and trying to figure out like what unique programs can we put in place to get people who may not have thought of a large bank or Citi as their first choice. How do you make sure they realize there's a place for them here? And it may not be even in your traditional finance aspects, but there's so much of technology, and there's so much that goes on in a place like Citi. I don't think, again, people realize the scope of skill sets that we have a need for here. So I think it's everything, taking a look at every, and right down to microfinance, and doing kind of more sort of explicit either female or minority-led financing, low-income housing. You could look at some of our ESG disclosures and see really how deep we take this. But you just need to ask the question, like, is there anything more we can be doing here? In almost every interaction that we have with our communities and third parties, and the answer is almost always going to be yes, there's more you can do here. Then how do you set realistic goals and hold people accountable? But I think there's the intent is there. I think we just need to stop ourselves from saying it's always been done this way. Is there a different way that we can approach this? And again, I think the answer is always going to be yes. Yeah.
So 2 follow-up questions. So many financial institutions are using AI and algorithms now, and there's a lot of criticisms that those are biased. There are sort of biases inherently built into them. So are you working on the technology to make sure that's not happening?
Look, I think if our intent is to, not only because of the laws, but our own corporate philosophies is to be equitable, you need to ask the question not only of human thought, but where we're relying on on machines and AI. So yes, we're absolutely kind of making sure that we're not having sort of inadvertent bias, whether intentional, non-intentional, conscious, unconscious, machine or human. We really need to say, like, if this is the intent of the organization, you need to make sure that as we venture into these new venues, where your first inclination may not be that there's an unintentional bias there. We need to make sure we're asking the question, because these are really kind of new worlds here to explore. And if we can teach the algorithms to be, neutral and unbiased, that's really the intent. So I think it's just as with anything else, as we go into the digital world and digital marketing and the algorithms and the like, we need to make sure we're being self-aware and self-critical, because again, these are new worlds, and we want to make sure we're laying the foundation appropriately.
Yeah. So the second follow-up question is just on sort of whether Citi feels an obligation to address sort of broader societal issues, so is part of your work in broadening your customer base and pushing for financial inclusion, designed to close the huge, gaping, growing, wealth inequality in the United States and other parts of the world. How does the company feel about its own employees and itself as an organization taking a stance on racial justice? I'd just love to hear sort of what the executives at a large financial institution in the United States feel about sort of their role in society now.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've seen it evolve, and it really started under, again, Mike Corbett, even before Jane was in the seat. But I'm proud of the fact that we have been unafraid of taking stances on, look, everyone's going to have different political views, but I think very logical stances on things like gun control, on, racial inequity, on on social issue, on voter availability, voter eligibility, on things that wouldn't necessarily have historically been thought of as the domain of a large corporate. I think we've taken the position that we are a member of the communities in which in which we operate, and so whether that's supporting the communities through volunteerism, through funding of low-income housing, through making sure people realize externally what we stand for as an organization, is all part of serving the community. And we've got a serious mantra around responsible finance that I think extends beyond just who we're lending to, but how we interact with our communities. And we took the stance around pay equity and gender representation. I mean we have in many cases been the first bank or one of the first larger organizations to wade into some of these issues, and we've lost clients over it. And you know what, that's okay. We'll continue to do so.
Yeah. So I want to jump to a lot of our audience questions. So there are a couple questions about returnship programs and also programs that might help people pivot from outside the finance industry into it.
Yep. So we've I think we've been aware of kind of returnship, and we're starting to get a little bit more formal in terms of our engagement. There's certainly, outside organizations that have specialized in this at various points over the year, or over time. Like I haven't taken, a break other than the one involuntary one post Lehman, but I tell people all the time that, again, this is the length of your career. You don't have to sprint there, right? Like their careers are built in very different ways. I have consciously not gone after that next big thing at a period of time where my husband was in, kind of a critical career path, or when my kids were very young. And it's okay sometimes to be comfortable for a period of time, or to take that time off for a period of time. It doesn't mean you can't get to, more senior levels. It just means you're self-aware of when you've got the capacity and the stamina to lean in harder versus kind of pulling back. Don't need to lean in all the time, not to use that analogy. But the same goes in a little bit more extreme case of actually entering or not the workforce. But there's a huge population of talented, women in particular, who've taken time off to have kids, who I think are anxious to figure out how they can contribute again. And there have been kind of formal, mentorship and the like, in order to do that. I think it's also a matter of making sure that we are very active within our own networks, in terms of keeping up on people we know who might be willing to come back in. So I think that's a huge pool, of latent talent, that I think we all recognize is out there, and it's important to come back.
And it sounds like Citi would also be open to people who have had, not standard finance industry.
Yeah.
So people pivoting from other places.
Absolutely. And we do and there's different programs for that. We're actually starting out we've got a Cupid program, and I'm gonna struggle with the acronym, but we're starting to do some internships for postgraduate, for people who are interested to see what it's like to work at a bank. We have tried to, and there's a woman, Vanessa Colella, who also reports to the CFO, who has a very varied career. She was a school teacher at one point. She's worked in the industry. She's worked in tech. She's been an entrepreneur. And it's actually fascinating to have her around the table, around a bunch of us who probably look more traditional on paper. And she's constantly asking the question about, we should be engaging with, schools that we don't typically engage with. We should be building, partnerships outside of Citi for people who realize you don't have to look like the people around this table to contribute. I wish there were more of her and more of those programs, but I think it's become, we're hiring like crazy right now, and not all those roles are traditional finance roles. It's a lot of technology. It's a lot of people who just know how to run processes well, a lot of things that don't require, a finance concentration. But if we're not making people aware of that and the fact that there's a place for them here, then that's on us.
Someone else is also asking about employing people with disabilities. Does Citi have programs to make that possible?
Absolutely, and that's another one of the kind of the affinities that we support. So, hopefully, I would say absolutely, and it probably takes a different form depending on what office, what function, whether we and the disability and the like. But absolutely, I would, just like I wouldn't tell anyone to limit themselves based on what they've done before. I also wouldn't ask anyone to limit themselves based on physical ability. We want everyone at the table.
Yeah. Okay. A quick follow-up on our childcare conversation. The listeners asking, if elder care is increasingly something that the HR department and managers are thinking about.
It is. Look, I think there's many probably around my age that have both young kids and elderly parents, and you end up being sort of sandwiched between the two. I think it's another reason why being, upfront about the kind of flexibility and support you need to be an effective, employee, and being able to kind of, again, bring your authentic self in is important. I don't know the specific, programs to quote, but there's a dialogue around the fact that that's a real, constraint, and, giving people the tools and the flexibility to be able to manage that is important. And look, we extend that even to how we think about financial products. There's a lot of conversations around our table in the last couple of years around the fact that, oftentimes, a person at a certain stage of life isn't just managing their finances, but they're advising a parent. They're trying to teach their children how to develop, responsible financial habits. And how do you make us more human as an organization by acknowledging, the realities of what people's lives look like today, and giving them the tools to help manage, whether that's as your employer or your bank.
Great. Okay, I'm going to go with two more questions. One is from an audience member. So he or she, probably she, is asking, how should we deal with diversity pushback? Especially from those who are in the majority that aren't ready for the sacrifices and awareness that comes with creating diversity, equity, and inclusion. So it sounds like you're not facing a lot of that at Citi, but do you have any advice?
Look, I'll be really honest. We have to walk a careful line. I had the same group that came together under my organization about a year ago because they really wanted to explore some of these issues. We bring speakers in now because we've kept up the dialogue, and we did have someone come in talk about how we are approaching diversity in the recruiting process. And I interjected several times to say, again, this is not about the fact that that hiring a diverse candidate is the end goal in and of itself. We're trying to create a better outcome where we're making better decisions and creating a better city for it. Because I think if we keep coming back to the core underlying objective, it becomes less about, oh, I don't have a shot at that role because I'm not diverse. Hopefully, because there probably are people who are afraid of that. And whether or not by opening up the door to someone else, it's closing the door to them. I think, making sure that we are getting the best people in the seats. And my message was, we've got to widen out the cast, how we cast the net for each one of these roles, because we want to get the best candidate into the role. And the more diverse we start off with, the better chance that that best candidate will be a diverse candidate. You know, and I think if you frame it that way, it gives some comfort that, you know, our priorities are still getting the best candidate in to create the best outcomes at the end of the day. But if we don't take it upon ourselves, our starting point will by definition be too narrow. And I think if you try and frame it inclusively like that, you can take a little bit of the fear away. But we face it here, absolutely.
Okay, so final question for you, and then I'll give the PowerToFly team some time for housekeeping. What is the one piece of advice that you try to give to young people who are interested in going to finance and banking, particularly women and people of color?
One, I think, is there's absolutely a place for you. I think and I think increasingly you're going to be able to find people who look more like you than maybe I had, you know, when I came in. I would be very open about how you think about, you know, mentors in the network that you build. I have had incredible mentors that were middle-aged white men, right? Who saw something in me even when I couldn't see it myself, who fostered it, who made sure I had the exposure and the, you know, and regardless, what you need is those advocates, no matter what they look like. And so I have sometimes had to remind myself to keep an open mind and not put stereotypes or preconceptions in my head about who that person might be. Either, like, you equally have to give them an opportunity to be that advocate for you without judging them ahead of, just like they have to do for you if you look different. And so I probably had to surround myself by some people in work, some people in my personal life, some people, you know, to create, you know, that diversity of exposure more so than maybe, you know, someone, you know, white male who came in. But I tried to give the benefit of the doubt to the senior people around me. Not all of them lived up to it, but some of them did, and I attached myself to them, and, you know, and built those relationships. I think you are more likely today to come in and find that type of mentorship with, you know, again, someone who looks more like you, but sometimes those relationships don't turn out to be what you'd expect them to be too, right? So I think coming in with a really open mind, assume positive intent, give people the opportunity to see who you are and advocate for you, you know, regardless of their background too. So there's a little bit of opening up your mind in both directions. And again, I always assumed I had the opportunity, and that people weren't holding me back for you know, the fact that I may have been the only woman in the room. And I very often found that it was the client that remembered me, or even in my last role where I dealt with, you know, a lot of very big hedge fund personalities. You know, if they didn't understand something, in some ways I felt like they were more comfortable telling me and we'd work through it than perhaps if they were, you know, speaking to, you know, speaking to another man. I mean, you got to find the benefit in your uniqueness and find a way to play that angle. There's always, being different is always you always find the benefit in being different.
Yes, absolutely. Difference is an asset.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Susan, well, it's been terrific talking with you. I feel like I learned a lot. I hope that our audience has too. And now I will turn it back over. Oh gosh, with 1 minute left. PowerToFly team.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for such an incredible conversation with so many incredible pieces of advice, and moving forward. And there was really awesome engagement in the chat with some different questions. So thank you so much to you both for participating, and the audience for chiming in with questions and comments.